This is the first part of the presentation on utilitarianism. I'm going to begin with Jeremy Bentham. Okay. Uh, Preliminary note. Utilitarianism is the flagship of consequentialist ethics. That is an approach to ethics that says we are to judge the moral fitness of actions in terms of their likely consequences. This is different from, as you'll recall, Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics, in which you're supposed to judge the moral fitness of an action according to, essentially by looking at the action itself to see if it is suitable, if it passes his test for being a legitimate moral precept. Okay? I say probable consequences in reference to consequentialism because, of course, we live in a world in which you cannot know for sure what the consequences will be. You can only judge on the basis of likely consequences, given the record of history and given such scientific information as we might have about a given topic. Okay? So, Bentham says a few things which are very important for understanding utilitarian ethics. First of all, what is the source of our notions of good and evil? Well, clearly it's not going to be God. It's not going to be divine command. It's not going to be necessary truths of reason as it is for Immanuel Kant. The source of our notions of good and evil, Bentham says straightforwardly, is pleasure and pain. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. Now, what does that mean? It means that it is natural for human beings to seek pleasure and to try to avoid pain. And you can see why this would have survival value for a human being. Now, Bentham's no fool. He understands that sometimes we will forego a pleasure in order to avoid some sort of supposed pain that would follow from it, or we may forego a small pleasure for the sake of the payoff of a greater pleasure later, or we may endure a smaller pain for the sake of avoiding a larger pain later. Okay, we calculate essentially. Pleasure and pain with the hopeful outcome that we'll have more pleasure than pain. Socrates talks in a dialogue called the Meno about mismeasure. He says, even if you're pursuing what is good, you're pursuing some good, you may mismeasure. He uses the analogy to visual mismeasure. If something is right in my face, it looks huge to me. Whereas if it's way off in the distance, it may look much smaller to me. Now, because of what we know about the world, we adjust our understanding, saying, "Well, yes, that's right near my face, so it looks huge." Whereas that other thing is way off in the distance, so it's much bigger than it appears to me. And Socrates says that we do that with pain and pleasure. A small pain that's right there in your face may seem overwhelmingly huge. Okay, whereas a much more significant pain that is looming on the horizon may appear small just because it's more remote. Now, a good example, one that's frequently used to explain this, is with smoking. Okay, that nicotine fit, that withdrawal from nicotine, is right there in your face when you're experiencing it. There's the notion that you might suffer later from emphysema, from heart problems, or from cancer. That seems very remote. So, because those pains are remote, you may in fact say, no, I've got to get relief from that nicotine fit because that's right here and right now, and seems much bigger than it is. In Yukio Mishima's 20th century novel, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, at one point the protagonist of the novel has a tooth extracted, and he's looking at the tooth, and he's He's furious. He's saying to the tooth, "You liar! You fooled me. While you were in my mouth, you made me feel as if you were the size of Mount Fujiyama, and that cavity was like a raging volcano. And yet, look at you. In fact, you're very tiny. That cavity was no more than a pinprick. You misled me totally as to your importance. You are not significant at all." Because this young man is obsessed with this beautiful, beautiful temple, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. He's especially resentful. You took my mind off of what was really important, which was appreciation of the Golden Pavilion. Well, that's an awfully good metaphor for things that happen in life all the time when we mismeasure pain and pleasure, when the immediacy of a pain or pleasure overwhelms our better judgment. Okay, so as I say, Bentham is not a fool when he says we're drawn to pleasure and we avoid pain. He knows that, and he makes it clear that he knows that. In real life, that can be a complicated thing to sort out. But by nature, for the survival of the individual and the species, we tend to avoid pain and embrace pleasure. Okay? Now, given these two sovereign masters, who is morally significant? Bentham says, he's distinguishing himself from Kant in saying this, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? For Kant, you remember, Kant thinks that if your rational faculties are inferior, you are not as morally significant. It's the irrational faculty that makes you morally significant. A person who is cognitively handicapped, or a person or a newborn baby, or an older person who has become senile. Those people literally don't have the rational faculties, don't have full rational faculties, and hence, in a Kantian scheme, it's usually interpreted they are not as important morally. Of course, Kant doesn't say you can be cruel to these individuals. And he says, in fact, you don't want to cultivate cruelty because that will have all sorts of ramifications that you want to avoid. But clearly, he doesn't think that they're as important. Bentham's rejecting this out of hand and saying what makes us morally significant is that it matters to us how we're treated. What makes any entity morally significant is that it matters to that entity how you treat it. I can sit here all day kicking the desk. You would be more worried about the damage to my foot than you would be about my terrorizing the desk. The desk doesn't care if I kick it. The desk doesn't have consciousness and doesn't care if I kick it. If it were a cat or a bird or a dog or a monkey or whatever, that would be a whole different kettle of fish, pun intended, because it would matter to that entity what I was doing. Like us, they avoid pain and pursue pleasure. So, can you suffer? If you can suffer, then you are morally significant. So, now you also, if you're looking at the handout on Bentham, you'll see a very odd-looking picture with the caption, "Can philosophers have a sense of humor?" What you are looking at when you see this picture is Jeremy Bentham stuffed by that's him, actually, stuffed by a taxidermist. In between his feet is his head on a platter. In his will, he specified that his entire estate was to go to the University of London, with whom he had been affiliated in his lifetime, on the condition that in perpetuity he had to attend every board meeting. Now, in order to make that happen, he ordered that his body be stuffed by a taxidermist dressed in his usual clothes, a wax effigy of his head put upon his shoulders with his usual wig and hat, and that his real head be, as he put it, preserved after the manner of the South American headhunters. So that head on a platter is Jeremy, with fake eyes, I suppose, glass eyes. And he's kept in a cabinet, and I've actually seen videos of this. He's kept in a cabinet. When they have a board of directors meeting, they open the cabinet and they wheel him out. And when they take roll, they say Jeremy Bentham attending, not voting. Why on earth would he do such a thing? There are any number of interpretations. Some people said he's just nuts. And others said, well, this is just a personal eccentricity, which is a sort of a milder version of the he's just nuts. I tend to view it as one of the most outrageously hilarious college pranks I've ever heard of in my life. I'll give you my whole estate, but I stay on the board of directors and I attend every meeting, and here's how we're going to do that. Now, if he's concerned about his actions providing pleasure to others, it should be noted that for quite some time, many years, this has been a source of amusement to many people. Okay, you might have thought, bury me, whatever, what good is that? Here's something that will actually give people some laughter. So, I don't claim that there's any kind of certainty to that interpretation, but I think it fits very well with what we know about his personality. Now, let's return to the matters of substance and look a little more carefully here. Utility, if you refer to your study guide, utility is that which produces pleasure in the agent. And so which produces pleasure in the agent is good, that which produces pain in the agent is bad. That's the principle. That's the way Bentham formulates the principle of utility. Now, I should note that good and bad have both a moral sense and a non-moral sense compared to Aristotle. Aristotle says if I call someone a good thief, I'm not saying he's a good man who happens to be a thief. I'm saying he's good at something. He has a particular skill. He may be an absolute rogue, even though he has a particular skill set. A good deal of Book One of the Republic deals with the notion that virtue can't be simply a matter of what skills you have, because whatever skills you have, you can use them either harmfully or benevolently. So, that which produces pleasure in the agent is to be taken for Bentham as morally good, because this is what the agent wants. We want a life that is more pleasant. That which produces pain in the agent is bad, prima facie, that is, without further analysis, it's bad because the agent would want to avoid pain. So this is, by Bentham's own acknowledgement, a retooling of the philosophy of Epicurus, an ancient Greek philosopher. Notice how oftentimes we reference the ancient Greeks. It's because so much of what comes to us from the Greeks, even if it didn't originate with them, so much of what comes to us through the Greeks or from the Greeks has, in fact, still a very lively role in the way we see the world today. Okay, Epicurus proposed a philosophy that's known as hedonism. Hedonism basically says essentially what Bentham just said. That which produces pleasure in the agent is good. That which produces pain in the agent is bad. His reasons are very similar to Bentham's. That, after all, is what the agent himself or herself wants. But we need to distinguish between psychological hedonism and ethical hedonism. Refer to your study guide, you'll see I have a little table distinguishing those. Psychological hedonism is what's known as a descriptive theory. A descriptive theory attempts to describe what is, in other words, to give us facts. Psychological hedonism would claim that the sole motive we have, if you analyze it down to the core motive, we're always trying to promote our own pleasure and reduce our own pain. It's an attempt to describe the way human beings actually act, what motivates us at core. Ethical hedonism is prescriptive. difference between prescriptive and descriptive is, while descriptive merely attempts to tell us what is, prescriptive attempts to tell us what we ought to do. Okay? Descriptive, facts. Prescriptive, values. Okay? Psychological hedonism is a descriptive theory, purports to tell us facts. Ethical hedonism is a prescriptive theory, purports to encourage us to embrace certain values that will guide our actions. Now, the one doesn't necessarily imply the other, and we're going to look at that in depth later. Okay, so just keep that on a back burner, that there is not a simple one-to-one relationship between the two. Bentham offered what he called the hedonic calculus, or calculus of pleasure. Okay, if we're going to say that producing pleasure is good and producing pain is bad, well, when we're comparing two actions, we'd be asking which one produces the most pleasure and the least pain, or which one produces the least pain and the most pleasure. Okay, we need a way of measuring, and this way of measuring, Bentham calls the hedonic calculus, or calculus of pleasure. The things that we should be looking at to make that measurement: intensity. A really intense pleasure is better than just a meh pleasure. Duration. Is this a very fleeting pleasure, or is it one that's going to last for a long time? Uncertainty versus certainty. In other words, when I do X, Y, and Z, is it pretty much guaranteed I'm going to have this pleasure, or is it like maybe it's a toss-up, it's a coin toss? Am I going to enjoy this, or am I not going to enjoy it? Near or far? Propinquity, he says, but let's put that into contemporary English. Is it near or far? In other words, can I easily access that pleasure, or is it in fact remote, and so I'm going to have to jump through a whole lot of hoops to ever get to that pleasure? It's preferable to have a pleasure that is, all other things being equal, a pleasure that is immediately accessible. Fecundity. That is, does it give birth to, literally, does it give rise to other pleasures? Certain pleasures, in fact, encourage or support or cultivate additional pleasures. Okay? In which case, there's value added, as we say today. And how mixed with pain? There are some pleasures that will be mixed with pain. Well, if you're saying, oh, so much pleasure, but there's this much pain, does that, do you have to subtract the pain from the pleasure to get a true value of whether whether this is a desirable action, especially if you're comparing it to another possible action? That can be a problem, and again, we'll look at that more closely in a moment. There's another part of this calculus of pleasure that needs to be looked at because it's very important for utilitarianism, but the way Bentham formulates it, it's a little suspicious. He says that another factor we should be considering is extent. If I make myself happy, am I making others happy as well at the same time? Okay, if I play my music very loud, I may be very much enjoying it. I may be making my neighbors miserable. Or my neighbors may actually, my neighbors may actually enjoy that music, in which case, crank it up. So I make a delicious dinner. I'm going to enjoy it. My wife is also going to enjoy it. So, how many moral agents will benefit? The idea is, understanding Bentham's motives, it's important to understand this. If my pleasure, he reasons, is a good, and your pleasure is a good, and this person's pleasure is a good, and that person's pleasure is a good, and so forth, then if my action will promote not only my own good, but the good of various other agents, it's a greater good, because there's the sum total of pleasure being promoted is greater. Okay, so I should not only try to promote my own pleasure, but act in a way that promotes my pleasure while also supporting the pleasure of others. Now, strictly speaking, the way Bentham has formulated this, most philosophers would agree it's a composition fallacy. Composition fallacy is a logical fallacy in which you say that whatever is true of each individual part is going to be true of the whole collection when you put them together. Okay? Well, let's see. Every individual part of my car, if you take my car, disassemble my car into small enough parts, every individual part can be lifted by me, unassisted. Put it all together, that doesn't mean I can lift the entire car at once. Why? Well, because while every individual part may be liftable, that doesn't mean that the composition, the whole collection, is itself liftable. Okay? 1 and 0. Not terribly complicated, right? This is a true story. Okay, this is a true story I'm about to tell. I'm not making this up. When I, for many years, worked in the software industry, and one company where I worked, there was a marketing manager who was notorious for selling a system to potential clients by promising them things that were going to be very difficult or impossible to deliver, and that were going to be very expensive for the software company to try to develop. And he didn't quite get, or at least he acted as though he didn't get why that was ever a problem. Hey, I sold the system, didn't I? Yeah, but by promising them stuff that, either we can't deliver or we shouldn't divert the resources to deliver. And one time during a company meeting, he actually said, in exasperation, look, I'm no programmer. That was an understatement. I'm no programmer, but I know that what you guys do is just a bunch of ones and zeros. So just write some more ones and zeros. How difficult can that be? Everyone sort of looked at each other and said, is he serious? Is he making a joke? And we realized, no, he's actually serious. Okay, well, that is a composition fallacy, and how? Yeah, the fact that writing a 1 or a 0 is simple doesn't mean that writing the whole source code is going to be simple. Okay. Many years ago, there was a conservative TV host named William F. Buckley, who had a program called Firing Line, in which he interviewed people, oftentimes interrogated them about their views. He had the person, he had as a guest on his program once, this is a long, long time ago, a gentleman who was currently the president of the Libertarian Party, or presidential candidate, I should say, of the Libertarian Party. And Buckley himself was very conservative, but thought the Libertarians were not to be taken seriously, which seemed to surprise this Libertarian fellow, because he seemed to think, well, Buckley, you should be on my side. At one point, the Libertarian candidate said, well, our view is that if I pursue my own self-interest to the max, and you pursue your own self-interest to a max, and everybody pursues their own self-interest to the max, at the end of the day, everyone's self-interest will have been met as well as possible. And Buckley just laughed and sat back and said, in his most his most snooty Harvard accent, shall we say, well, we both know that's a composition fallacy, don't we? And the poor Libertarian fellow just sort of squirmed in his seat like, did you have to say that? Yes, I know it's a fallacy. But yeah, it is a fallacy. And actually, when we talk about ethical egoism, we'll talk about that in greater depth. The fact that everybody is pursuing their own self-interest to the greatest extent possible doesn't mean at the end of the day everyone's interest will be met to the greatest extent possible. It may simply mean that those who are most ruthless and cunning at the end of the day will have more than they need, while others who have made a sincere and honest effort will go without. That is a danger, okay? But you get the idea of what a composition fallacy is. Now, Bentham is motivated by the notion that we should expand moral significance to more and more and more beings. Because of that, I should not just be worried about my own pleasure and pain. I should be worried about the pleasure and pain of others. It's important to understand some of the motivations for Bentham's point of view. First of all, he lives in a time when there was a great deal of income inequality. Not only between Britain and its colonies, but between the classes in Britain. Industrial Revolution, you found people leaving their agrarian lifestyle by necessity, as the commons was being devoured. You find people without enough food. You find people without decent housing. You find people without access to medical care. Glad that doesn't happen today, huh? And all this in the midst of people who were essentially gluttonous, who had far more than they needed, far more than they could use. Boy, good thing that doesn't happen today either, huh? Well, moving right along. He saw there are people who are being treated as if they are morally insignificant, as if they are not really people. And part of his motivation for his philosophy is clearly to create a society that was more humane, more fair, more compassionate. So, rather than simply toss out the baby with the bathwater, we might want to simply say, he can't prove his point this way, but we might want to return to it later and see if you can make a good argument on why we should be concerned about the common good. And indeed, Peter Singer will spend time trying to make that case. Bentham, unlike Kant, who said only rational agents are morally significant, Bentham wants to include non-human animals. Okay, non-human animals can suffer. I mean, most civilized people are appalled by needless, avoidable cruelty to animals, or at least those animals who they relate to as a being. Let's say, cute and cuddly. Okay, cute and cuddly makes us want to treat something better than if we don't consider it cute and cuddly. We'll kick a possum, whereas you would be furious if you would have seen someone kicking a cat. Americans, much to the puzzlement of Koreans, Americans get very upset that Koreans kill and eat dogs. I've known people who've eaten dog, and I asked, what does it taste like? And they said, it just tastes like dog. Well, but what kind of flavor is that? It's hard to describe. Pork doesn't taste the same as beef. Beef doesn't taste the same as chicken. Chicken doesn't taste the same as fish. Dog doesn't taste the same as anything but dog. Well, Americans even try to, use petitions and economic sanctions and so forth to try to boycotts, whatever, to try to get Koreans to stop butchering dogs. And yet, we will butcher pigs. In fact, we will raise pigs in what are incredibly inhumane and unnatural conditions in order to raise them for the sole purpose of slaughtering and eating them. Well, it is a simple fact of comparative neuropsychology that a pig is smarter than a dog. In fact, in the wild, pigs are ferocious predators, and they are very smart. Okay, now generally people in our culture don't keep pigs as pets, so we think of dogs as, oh yeah, he understands every word I say, and of course he has feelings and blah 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 blah. If you raised a pig the same way, you might be surprised. Or if you raise dogs the same way we raise pigs, they might seem significantly less worthy of compassion. Why? Because we never wrote compassion into the scenario for how we were going to treat them. Old teacher of mine and friend of mine said that he had two neighbors at one point. One was an old German woman who had a little dachshund as a pet, and on the other side of his house lived a Vietnamese family, and they had a little pot-bellied pig, which is a fairly common pet in some parts of the world. And they kept it as a pet, and the German woman kept taunting, if you will. I mean, joking, but it was not the nicest joke. When are you going to let me butcher that pig and eat it? Finally, the Vietnamese gentleman replied to her, When are you going to let me butcher that dog of yours and eat him? And as my friend told the story, after that exchange, the German woman never joked about butchering the pig again. Okay? A lot of this is just very arbitrary and based upon social conventions that could have been entirely different. We talk about ethical relativism. We'll bring that up again, too. Okay? There's a problem in logic called a Seratus Paradox. Seratus Paradox is a problem that occurs when two opposites change into one another by degree, and there's no clear and natural place to draw the line. But for some reason, we need to draw that line. A good example of that, people seem to understand right away, is at what point are you biologically dead? Well, for many years, people said it's when your heart stopped beating and couldn't be revived. Then heart transplants became viable, and it became cessation of brain activity. And then after people realized that, parts of your brain may die while other parts are still, we can sustain them artificially. Your brain stem, the primitive parts of your brain, can be kept going artificially while the rest of your brain is dead and can't be revived. If you follow medical ethics at all, Terry Schiavo case. Last time I taught medical ethics, the Terry Schiavo case was in the news. It's a matter of a woman had been in a vegetative state, not a coma, but a vegetative state for about a decade. And sonograms were showing that her brain actually was liquefying, basically rotting inside of her skull. And at that point, the husband said, pull the plug. This is grotesque. She's gone. There's no way to get her back. Pull the plug. And the parents opposed it because they said, no, look, she's not dead. Maybe she'll come out of it. No, you can't. If your brain turns to liquid, you don't come out of that. Okay. And of course, there was a lot of emotional denial on their part. You've got to feel bad for them, but her face would twitch because she's getting electrical impulses run through her. Her face would twitch. See that? She's trying to speak. No. Very, very sad. And a lot of opportunistic politicians jumped in and meddled with it. And the courts finally said, look, nobody's got, the husband, under Florida law, the husband's got the right to say, let's pull the plug. And nobody else has legal standing to interfere with that. Okay. Then Governor Jeb Bush was actually trying to intervene, trying to get his brother, George Bush, who was president at the time, to get Congress to intervene. That's simply not recognizing something that we would call a Seratus Paradox. There is a large gray area. Your whole brain doesn't die at once. The whole person doesn't die at once. Where do we draw the line? Well, we figure out, to solve a Seratus Paradox, you figure out what are we trying to accomplish? And you draw the line at whatever place would best facilitate whatever end you're after, whatever it is you want to try to do. Okay, now that's a more elaborate explanation would have to be in either a logic course or my intro philosophy course. So, just what it is. So how does that relate here? Telling the difference between pleasure and pain could be a Seratus Paradox. Whether a being is capable of suffering, has enough cognitive sophistication to be considered morally significant on account of the ability to function, to have feelings, to have pleasure and pain, to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. That can be a Seratus Paradox. There has been controversy for some time. Do lobsters suffer when you throw them into the pot of boiling water? And I've heard a number of people say, no, they don't have the prefrontal lobes, so they can't possibly suffer. And people with the appropriate expertise in biology have said that's ludicrous. By that logic, they also can't see. They also can't move. Clearly, there is equivalence of function with a brain that's structured differently. Okay, so it can be tricky. Who can suffer, to what extent they can suffer, can be tricky. And a lot of times, if we want an excuse for being cruel or being callous, we'll just look to a resolution of the Seratus Paradox that is not perhaps the most honest one, but the most convenient one for us. So, it gets complicated, doesn't it? Okay, Yam Gruel, another possible criticism of this approach. Yam Gruel. What is Yam Gruel? Have you ever had gruel? It's like porridge, basically, or grits. It's, in this case, made out of yams, Yam Gruel. It's the name of a short story by Akutagawa, who is a modern Japanese writer. Akutagawa wrote the two short stories that formed the basis of Kurosawa's script for Rashomon, just to give that some context. In Yam Gruel, the plot is that there's a simple peasant who is a tenant farmer for a lord, and the lord holds a festival once a year for his tenant farmers, a feast for them. Well, this poor fellow, after having several bowls of yam gruel, wipes his mouth and says, "Yam gruel is the best food ever. I wish I could have yam gruel and nothing but yam gruel, morning, noon, and night for the rest of my life." And of course, that's all hyperbole, right? But the Lord overhears it and says, "Let that be done. Let this man have yam gruel and only yam gruel for every meal the rest of his life. I command it." Well, you can figure out what happens, right? It doesn't take very long before that poor fellow is just sick at the very thought of yam gruel. Okay? What can give us pleasure on one occasion may not give us pleasure on another occasion. What can give us pleasure only because it's in small quantities, only because the anticipation of it factors in, may, in overabundance, no longer give us pleasure. This is one of the reasons why utilitarians, just as Kant did, value autonomy. I have to be able to make my own decisions. Okay? I don't need to have a rule that says, always eat chocolate ice cream because it gives you more pleasure than vanilla. Or always have yam gruel. What I need is a rule that says, I can choose that, and I can choose that on the fly. I don't have to choose that as a general principle. The general principle is to do that which will promote pleasure and avoid that which will promote pain. And that is sometimes going to depend a great deal on circumstance, is it not? So I need to be able to decide without some set of rules that tries to micromanage those decisions. Now, perhaps a more important criticism is that this whole notion of hedonic calculus, okay, calculus of pleasure, is essentially an explanatory fiction. How do I know whether I should eat the chocolate or the vanilla? The chocolate will give me more units of pleasure, which Bentham calls hedons, than the vanilla will. What if the vanilla is giving me brain freeze? Okay, then I have to subtract those negative hedons, if you will, from the positive hedons that I got from the pleasure. Well, this is giving sort of a veneer of scientific exactitude to what is really a much more seat-of-the-pants experiential context for making decisions. Another reason why autonomy is important. Hedons are an explanatory fiction. Right? People sometimes reading about them say, "What the heck is a hedon? How do you even detect it? What is this referring to?" Well, it's a concept that we can use to arrange and interpret our experience but to start to treat it as a real thing is perhaps an example of what's in logic sometimes called a reification fallacy. You take something that was just invented as a convention to explain things or to manage a situation, you start treating it as if it is a real part of nature, and that can sometimes lead to great confusion. Okay, so another thing that I think Bentham would say is, look, nobody, pretty much speaking generically, there may be individual exceptions, people don't want to starve. They don't want to have their children trucked off to work in factories at age 5. They don't want to die from the bad air in the factory, die of emphysema at a young age. They don't want to freeze in the winter and swelter in the summer. They want decent housing. We only have to be able to paint this broadly in order to justify creating a more pleasant life, a less painful life for anything that's able to suffer. And that really is the goal. Okay? Now, of course, if we demand a greater degree of exactitude than is possible, and then perhaps we are setting the bar so high that we have written failure into the scenario. I would like to suggest that. You remember one of the quotations that we started the course with was from the one writing an essay in the anthology House and Philosophy. There is perhaps no single moral strategy that is going to guarantee the best outcome for everyone involved. So we have to always ask, what are we trying to achieve? What good are we trying to expedite? Sounds familiar. And what means are we using to try to expedite it? That all sounds familiar, doesn't it? Okay, we'll do the reading in Stirba, look at the study guide, and we'll move on now to John Stuart Mill.